Hello there and welcome to Monday in Parliament. Coming up, the Health Secretary comes under fire after it's revealed hundreds of thousands of patient letters were put into storage instead of being posted.
2 months into 2017 and the Health Secretary lurches from one crisis to another.
There is no evidence so far that any patient safety has been put at risk.
Peers begin their detailed scrutiny of the Brexit triggering bill. And the Speaker pays tribute following the death of the Commons' longest-serving MP, Sir Gerald Kaufman.
There was that fidelity to principle, that commitment to causes, that insistence on doing his duty by his constituents, by his party and by his country.
But first, the Health Secretary has told MPs that some 500,000 documents containing medical information, including cancer test results, were mistakenly put into storage rather than being sent to the GP or filed in patients' records. The error occurred when a mail redirection company, NHS Shared Business Services, hired by the Health Service in England, failed to pass on documents that had either been incorrectly addressed or needed rerouting because the patient had moved to a new GP surgery. Patients in the East Midlands, the South West and North East London were affected. The Health Secretary confirmed that 2,000 of the higher risk cases had now been reassessed by doctors at a cost of £2.2 million, with no harm detected. The remaining 500 are still being assessed. Jeremy Hunt explained in total more than 700,000 items had been involved.
200,000 pieces were temporary residence forms and a further 500,000 pieces were assessed as low risk. A first triage identified a further 2,500 items which had potential risk of harm and needed further investigation, but follow-up by local GPs has already identified nearly 2,000 of these as having no patient harm. The remainder are still being assessed, but so far no patient harm has been identified.
He explained why he hadn't gone public with the information sooner.
Publicising the issue could have meant GP surgeries being inundated with inquiries from worried patients, which would have prevented them doing the most important work, namely investigating the named patients who were potentially at risk.
This is a catastrophic breach of data protection. Over 500,000 patients' data, including blood test results, cancer screening results, biopsy results, even correspondence relating to cases of child protection, all undelivered. They were languishing in a warehouse on the Secretary of State's watch. It's an absolute scandal, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, this Health Secretary promises us transparency. Well, today he stands accused of a cover-up. 2 months into 2017 and the Health Secretary lurches from one crisis to another. Hospitals overcrowded, waiting lists out of control. He can't deliver the investment our NHS needs. He can't deliver a social care solution. He can't deliver patient safety, and now he can't even deliver the post, Mr. Speaker. He has overseen a shambles that puts patient safety at risk. Patients deserve answers and they deserve an apology.
There is no evidence so far that any patient safety has been put at risk.
The Secretary of State just stated with great authority that no patient data was lost. I'd be interested to know if, how he can be so certain, given that all of this data was missing for a long time without anybody noticing. What controls are in place now that weren't in control then, that weren't in place then, that means he can make that statement with such confidence?
Well, can I welcome her to this House? I don't know if she's done a health question with me before, but let me say to her that we are assured that the data was not lost. It was kept in secure setting, which means that it was safe, it wasn't breached, it wasn't accessed by anyone else.
I used to work in a pathology lab, and it absolutely pains me to think of those results that are generated by the hard work of pathology staff languishing in a warehouse somewhere, unseen by anybody. Now, I know what GPs will do if they don't get path lab results. They'll ring the laboratory and ask for them. So has the Secretary of State made any estimate of the amount of time wasted in phone calls from GP surgeries to pathology labs?
Well, regrettably, I'm sure that because of what happened, extra work was created for GPs. But what I would say to the Honourable Lady is, it's because of GPs' commitment to their own patients that it appears that in the vast majority of cases, patient harm was avoided, because when results don't come through that a GP is expecting, the GP chases those results.
But my constituents in Kettering will be amazed that for 5 years, no one spotted that 700,000 records had gone missing. So can I ask him, how was it discovered? And why is it that in these 3 areas, such a large amount of data effectively disappeared from public view?
Well, I wish I could give him the answer to that question. I do think it is. I do think it is completely extraordinary that for such a long period of time it wasn't noticed that this data had gone missing. And I think it was discovered towards the end of the SBS contract. And I think that there are lessons in the NHS which relate very closely to what other honourable members have said about the dangers of over-reliance on paper rather than electronic systems, where it's much, much easier to keep track of what's happening. And let me say to the honourable gentleman opposite, who continues to make comments from a sedentary position, that when it comes to making the NHS electronic, I think people will compare his government's record and ours, and they'll say which is better.
Jeremy Hunt. In the Lords, peers were beginning their detailed scrutiny of the bill, paving the way for Theresa May to trigger the UK's exit from the EU. By tradition, peers don't vote on amendments at committee stage, keeping their powder dry until later in the legislative process. But a Labour peer and former Cabinet Minister, Peter, now Lord Hayne, pushed his amendment, arguing that the UK should stay in the single market, to a vote.
Leaving the single market will cause untold harm to the economy and people's jobs, which will be felt most keenly in the already disadvantaged nations and regions where I live, Wales, for example. A hard Brexit will therefore have damaging consequences for the union of our United Kingdom and also for the island of Ireland.
What's at stake here is jobs, living standards and rights. And bear that in mind. We're playing poker if we go down the government route with the people's livelihoods on a very, very big scale. Are we likely to get that comprehensive free trade agreement within 2 years? I've not met anybody yet who knows anything about trade negotiations who thinks that's the case.
Nobody's arguing, I don't think, I've never met a person who says we shouldn't have access, we shouldn't do business with the single market, in the same way as they'll want to do business with us. The question is whether we want to be members of it.
And they've accused my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, of opting for a hard Brexit. My Lords, I submit that is nonsense. The Prime Minister has not opted for a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit or any sort of squishy Brexit. She's merely attempting to carry out the wishes of the people to leave the EU. And that automatically means leaving the single market, because if we stay in the single market, we're still in the EU to all intents and purposes.
Unless we get some kind of access to the single market, we are sacrificing the integrated supply chains which so many of our smaller businesses depend upon. And it seems to me that if we believe no deal is better than a bad deal, what we are really doing is gambling millions of manufacturing jobs, 10% of our GDP.
Now, of course, the single market is not perfect, notably in its coverage of all services, but almost half British trade in goods and services takes place in the European market, almost half. And it should be an absolute priority, therefore, for us to secure the continuity of that trade we already have.
But Labour's front bench said it couldn't back Peter Hayne's amendment, saying that the UK should continue to be a member of the single market.
Our task is to persuade the government that they have set their sat-nav for the wrong destination, and that's where our energies must go. But giving people the unrealistic hope that staying in the market, single market, despite the referendum and our exit, is a possibility, is, I think, an unfair thing to make them think could happen. We need to continue to trade as freely as possible with the EU that we have to leave. And for that reason, we are not able to support this amendment.
And what I would ask, my lords, is that those of your lordships who, like me, voted to remain, stop fighting the battles of the campaign, but come together to help us to think of ways in which we can continue to thrive, continue to trade, and to overcome some of these challenges. But, my lords, the issue raised by this amendment are indeed worthy of debate, but with the greatest of respect, this amendment has no place in this bill and would undermine the expressed intent of the British people, which is to leave the EU.
But Peter Hain pushed his amendment, attacking his party's leadership.
My criticism is for my party leader, because I think he will be judged by history as being on the wrong side of this argument, of forcing us to do something in the Labour Party that we do not actually in our hearts really believe in. I do not lightly go against my party whip. In my 26 years in Parliament, in the Commons and here, I've only ever done this once or twice. But this for me is a matter of absolutely crucial importance to this country and to the future of people, their jobs and their prosperity. And the truth is, the Minister, with all due respect, he's doing a great job on the sticky wicket. But the truth is, he hasn't a clue, and the government hasn't a clue where we're going. They have no idea where they're taking us. I think for the sake of jobs, prosperity, our businesses, it is important to pass this amendment, and I therefore wish to divide the House.
But when it came to the vote, Peers rejected Lord Hain's amendment to try to keep the UK in the single market.
My Lords, they have voted content 136, not content 299. The not contents have it.
Peers voting on the Brexit triggering bill in the House of Lords, and there'll be more on that later in the week. You're watching Monday in Parliament with me, Alicia McCarthy. A fund intended to ease the pressures on adult social care services and hospitals in England has been described by MPs as a bit of a fraud and window dressing. The watchdog, the National Audit Office, has said the £5.3 billion Better Care Fund has not succeeded in keeping patients out of hospital or saved any money, although the NAO said it had helped to join up social care and health in some areas. Appearing before the Public Accounts Committee, senior health figures argued that the fund was working, but it was too soon to judge its full impact.
It's just not working, is it, though? The NAO report says it's not working. I think you would agree that, surely.
What I wanted to say, I mean, this is an incredibly complex
we know, so Mr. Wilmot, I'm just aware we have limited time today. We could go round the houses on the challenges, but this report says that the Better Care Fund, the integration that it was supposed to achieve, the saved admissions to A&E that it was supposed to achieve, hasn't delivered, and it's actually cost money. Do you agree with me?
Not entirely, no. Do
you agree with the NAO report?
I agree with the NAO report, and I thought it set out very fairly where the Better Care Fund has made progress, and it has in some important respects, and where it has not. So I think my answer with the question was I agreed with the rather more nuanced picture that the National Audit Office presented of where things have improved and where they have not. We think, and this is shown in the National Audit Office, that local areas report that the Better Care Fund in the vast majority of cases is driving better joint decision making. It has shown improvements across two of its metrics as set out.
I think, Mr. Wilmot, I mean, you
and not in others.
Were you over optimistic in setting the targets and savings that were achievable through this?
No, I think the Better Care, and we talked about this back in December 2014, didn't we? And I think we had quite a frank exchange at that point. The Better Care Fund Mark I, which is what I regard this, was an initiative by the government to transfer funding from the NHS to social care in recognition of the great pressures facing social care. So did it achieve its intended aim of increasing the funding available to local authorities for social care in 2015-16? Yes, it did. So in that sense, it has been a success.
It didn't actually achieve anything in reducing the number of emergency admissions to A&E, did it?
Well, I don't think it was ever likely to, as of some sort of magic between March 31st, 2015 and April 1st, 2015. And in fact, I think that's what I laid out for you in 2014.
I think you did actually also, you also laid it out rather nicely, better care fund maths and real world maths. I think in June of last year, which we thought summed it up perhaps quite well. So actually, so really it was all a bit of a fraud, wasn't it? The money was going to go from your budget to local government budgets, but wasn't actually going to achieve anything in reducing costs to the NHS, which was one of the longer term aims of this.
Well, it was supporting social care financing.
To help save pounds in the NHS.
To help social care funding pressures.
I think the underlying problem is the shortfall of funding for adult social care. It's not the Better Care Fund is an attempt to put some more money in, the new Better Care Fund is an attempt to put a bit more in. It will help. Social care would have been cut by more without the NHS transfer funds, definitely, because it was used to prevent cuts.
So what you're really saying is actually this isn't really much in the way of more money. This is window dressing. It's just moving money from pot A to pot B.
But the problem with always thinking that by putting some money in we'll get some improvements and better things is we're just plugging a gap of money that's been taken away while demand is rising. So population 65 plus has gone up by 15% in the period we're talking about. And actually over 40% of adult social care budgets isn't spent on older people at all. It's spent on people aged 18 to 64. 35% is on people with learning disabilities alone, where the pressures are equally great. So there's a huge set of issues here. And although I wouldn't dismiss BCF or improve BCF as unwelcome resource, it's not getting to the nub of the problem.
The question as to what budget a council puts to its social care services, that's obviously tied up with a whole bigger national debate about local authority financing and local democracy.
A short time later in the Commons, MPs debated the next round of funding for health and social care in England.
The idea that we have an NHS that's on a sustainable footing, I'm afraid, is simply not the case. And so what I would ask ministers is to be realistic about the current position, and I would ask our Chancellor in his forthcoming budget to address this by urgently giving a lifeline to social care, because that will benefit not only social care but the NHS.
She called for a joined-up approach for the future, a call echoed by the chair of another influential committee.
We do need a long-term generational shift in how we're going to do this, because we cannot just keep lurching from crisis to crisis and funding situation to funding situation.
Meg Hillier. The day in the Commons began with tributes following the death of the Labour MP Sir Gerald Kaufman. Sir Gerald was the oldest MP and also held the title of Father of the House, as he had the longest unbroken service as a member of the Commons, being elected in 1970. He famously called his party's left-wing 1983 election manifesto the longest suicide note in history. The Speaker, John Bercow, led the tributes, saying he would be sorely missed.
I will not pretend that he was always the easiest of colleagues. If you were lauded or praised by Gerald, you doubtless took delight in the experience. If you were attacked or denounced by Sir Gerald, you could be in no doubt on the matter. But there was that fidelity to principle, that commitment to causes, that insistence on doing his duty by his constituents, by his party, and by his country. Gerald will be mourned very widely indeed.
And MPs will get the chance to pay their tributes later in the week. Meanwhile, in the Lords, cross-party tributes were paid to the former Lords leader and Home Secretary, Lord Waddington, who died last week. David Waddington served in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet during the final year of her premiership from 1989 to 1990. He was appointed as leader of the House of Lords by John Major.
A man of principle and grit, a tenacious and committed servant to the British public who effected real change, leading the charge from the backbenches on major legislation, such as the amendment he carried to the Criminal Justice and Immigration Bill in 2008.
I think it's fair to say that he wasn't one of life's natural Liberal Democrats. But my colleagues did cheer when, as Home Secretary, he referred the case of the Birmingham Six to the Court of Appeal, where, of course, their convictions were eventually quashed.
In some ways, he wrote his own obituary when, in an interview in the House magazine some years ago, he said, with disarming self-deprecation, and I think he was having a joke, but I would like to be remembered as a decent local buffer who wasn't all that clever, but in his own way tried to do his best. Lady Smith of Basildon paying tribute to Lord Waddington. Now, the number of assaults carried out on NHS staff in England by patients or members of the public is rising and now stands at close to 200 a day. Such is the concern that a petition launched by the radio DJ Nick Ferrari calling for such attacks to be made a specific criminal offence has attracted nearly 117,000 signatures. In a debate in Westminster Hall, MPs told horror stories of some of the violence NHS workers had suffered.
I'll draw members' attention to one example I was given of a 35-year-old ambulance technician from Cornwall who was punched in the face by a drunk and aggressive woman whilst at work. Now, she sustained a broken jaw and she's had at least 12 surgical procedures since then and is still suffering from symptoms. She had a titanium jaw implant put back in September 2016, but since then she's had to have 2 further procedures and cannot open her mouth wider than finger width at the moment. She was attacked in 2006. That's over a decade of agony and suffering, and we owe it to people like her and everyone else attacked just doing their job to stand up and send a message that attacks on NHS staff are contemptible, and we will do everything in our power to stop them.
One piece of testimony from an NHS staff nurse describes how, in her, quote, 20-year nursing career, I have been spat at, punched, kicked, verbally abused, and even had a cardiac monitor thrown at my head. Another talks about how she works, quote, in an A&E department as a staff nurse. On a daily basis, I see some sort of aggression, whether this is physical or verbal, towards staff. I can't recall a day that has gone by where we have not had to have security or police in the department. But perhaps even more worrying than this is evidence given to the Petitions Committee by the Royal College of Nursing, which suggests that there's a dangerous perception that some female nurses fear that they're seen as, quote, fair game for sexual assault. Now, I'm quite sure that members will find this quite appalling.
It is undeniable that our NHS staff are under a great deal of pressure at the moment, with long waiting lists, patients waiting on trolleys in corridors, and having to deal with angry relatives because of this. The government, with the current handling of the NHS, appear to be creating a perfect storm of unrest and discontent amongst patients and relatives, which is likely to exacerbate tension and ill feeling, and the government must take some responsibility for this.
I'm the daughter of a retired police sergeant and a nurse, and both parents thank you very much and both parents were subject to abuse as part of their roles as public servants, and so this is an issue that I feel very strongly about.
If you're under time pressure, as of course we've seen in this winter in accident emergency, actually that just pours petrol on the flames, because someone is going, excuse me, can I speak to you? My wife is ill or my child is ill, and people are running past all the time, and then eventually a gasket blows. So this is not always someone who's coming in with the tattoos, you know, love, hate or whatever, making it obvious that they're trouble. It's someone who's frightened. But to de-escalate that requires training, it requires support, it requires backup, and more than anything else, it requires time.
But the Minister thought the penalties already available to the courts were sufficient.
Given the current offences framework and sentencing guide, which, as I say, make provision for an increase in sentence to be considered where the victim of an assault is a public sector worker, I am not persuaded that there is a need to create a specific offence for this particular group of workers.
Finally, the new MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central has taken his seat in the Commons. Gareth Snell held the seat for Labour in last week's by-election. He won the seat with a majority of just over 2,500, with UKIP in second place.
I, Gareth Craig Snell, do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare
and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law.
The by-election was caused when the previous MP, Tristram Hunt, decided to stand down from Parliament to run the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And that's it from me for now, but do join Keith McDougall at the same time tomorrow for another roundup of the best of the day here at Westminster. But for now, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.